Hey guys, so after the last video I put up, I was putting feelers out for what people wanted to hear me talk about or whatever, and I had an idea for a little discussion or thing to talk about for this little video. And today I wanted to talk about the relationship between Japanese and American cinema, especially when it pertains to westerns in American cinema and what is called Jidaigeki in Japanese cinema, which is translated to mean period drama. There's a lot of interesting parallels between these two film genres, and I kind of wanted just to talk through some things, some insights that I have. Being someone who, as I talked about the other day with my Blu-ray collection, is someone who really likes samurai and Japanese period films, and who's seen and learned about the correlation and connection with American westerns, and just the interesting interplay between these two genres and these two, schools of thought, essentially, when it comes to film. And just real quick, in the beginning, I'm going to explain what both of these genres are, the kind of really short history. I'm not an expert in any of this by any means. I did some research, some stuff that I wrote down. I read a couple things that I might pull up and reference. But this is mostly just like a jumping off point. If any of this interests you, I definitely recommend looking into it more. If you're someone who's interested in westerns as a film genre, if you're someone who's interested in Jidaigeki or any other type of Japanese film, definitely look into this. I think it's really interesting. But first, let's just talk about what both of these genres are. So, like I described before, like I said before, Jidaigeki is a Japanese period drama. They generally take place during the Edo period of Japanese history, which is, I have all this stuff written down, so I'm looking down at my notes, is roughly from 1603 to 1868. It's a wide area of history in Japan. And it generally is stories about normal people, peasants, samurai, the interplay of the classes and things like that. And a lot of the most popular films, because Jidaigeki is just a period film, it doesn't have a specific action or romance type of genre trope. It's more of just it's set in this period. There is a subsection, which is one of the most popular ones, is what samurai films fall into, which is the more action-oriented, the more adventure or that sort of thing, where it's the main characters are generally samurai or ronin, and it's their exploits, fighting in wars, fighting bandits, fighting each other, a lot of that stuff. And a lot of these films, like I said, take place in that time frame. So the film as a thing started late 19th century, rudimentary, and then really picked up in the early 20th century, in the aughts and the 20s and things like that. And that's when, around the entire world, not just in Europe and in America, and you start to see some of the very first films in Japan are these period pieces. Now, westerns. A lot of people know what westerns are. Westerns take place in 19th century America, most notably in the West, beyond the Mississippi River, and it deals with the characters, cowboys, Native Americans, bandits. That's a character trope in westerns, and it's essentially the life in the Old West, as it's described, before all of like the state structure and what we would see as the government structure of America today. If you're an American, you have an idea of what the West, the Old West is, what a Western is. Now, Westerns, much like these Jidaigeki, are some of the first films that we make in America. And I was thinking, why is it that instead of making contemporary films, which we did, but what's this fascination with America and with the Japanese, with these times before, these periods before of history? Why do we want to tell stories from then? Why do we want to give so much credence to them? And then I can talk about like the influences they had on each other, some of the influences anyway. I read, in my research for this talk, I read a part of an article from where did you go? There we go. From Stephen Kiss Sr., Stephen Kiss, he's a senior librarian, language and literature, at the Stavros Narkis Foundation Library, and it's available on the New York Public Library website. I'll put a link to his little article here. And his question that he poses is, what phenomenon occurred in 1949, exploded in 1959, and more or less faded in the late 60s? And it's the TV Western. Now, there's been Western films since the advent of film. The Great Train Robbery is one of the early films in American history, and it's a Western. And according to Stephen here, I posed the question to the internet: why were Westerns so popular in this time frame? And I chose the 50s and 60s, mostly because that's when televisions were very prominent in America post-war, and a bunch of TV shows were being produced, and a lot of money was being put instead of into Hollywood films, which it was that was still a thing, but instead of just Hollywood films, a lot more money and time and thought was put into television shows, and a lot in this time period, a lot of shows were produced. Between 1949 and 1969, 1970, there were 143 shows that could be considered a Western. Shows like Gunsmoke and things like that. 143 shows in 20 years of one genre. That's a lot. Now, Westerns are still sort of a thing, but they aren't as popular. And I was curious as to why in American cinema and American television, the Western period was so popular. To Stephen here, I'm going to quote what he says in this. He says, Westerns sought to teach the good values of honesty and integrity, of hard work, racial tolerance, determination to succeed, and of justice for all. They were, in a sense, modern morality plays where heroes, strong, reliable, clear-headed, and decent, fought their adversaries in the name of justice. Early TV Western series helped define America as a nation. And I can see that. I can see that, and I can also see this other part that's not in this article. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about what he's saying and why he thinks this. He goes and he breaks down a couple shows that he enjoys personally. I didn't want to include that specifically in this because it's not really about specific shows. It's more about tropes, and it's more about like the thought process in making these. But he talks about how certain shows, they'll have like a formula where there's like a moral statement at the end, a moral lesson that has to be learned. But, that's not true for every show. There are a lot of shows that are just action-oriented. or, you know, just trying to show that period in all of its quote-unquote glory. And I wondered why that period to us is so interesting. And compared to, revolutionary time, or between, expansion and, before that history, or even pre, America, but, that's kind of more muddy water, since why would we make shows about a nation that's not ours? And I think it's because part of the Western expansion that led to the Old West is kind of like this distillation of American ideals of, not just physical expansion, but, wanting to push boundaries and wanting to be bigger and boundless in a way. And the Western is the perfect setting for that, because, there's these wide open plains and these mountain ranges and things like that. And that's just for the setting. But then there's also the level of conflict. And we all know that action films, in their many iterations, are more titillating, more engaging than, say, just a normal drama or a comedy or what have you. That we thrive or are extremely excited by conflict, and that, point in our history is rife with conflict. If it's not, conflicts with the natives, then it's conflicts with each other over land disputes, or, the lawlessness of the Old West, and things like that, where it's a type of America that could have been, that was, but is gone now. That kind of it harkens to, in one point, the infancy of America, because it was, this point of expansion and everything, but also this like rustic, rugged, just I can't think of the right word, but just this really intense point in our history. And I think, and you think about the demographic of the people who are watching these shows, right? It's the 40s, late 40s, post-war, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Mostly men, like 80, 90% men watching these shows. And they're all in the older, generation, who probably had family who, like close relatives who lived in that part of the part of history, or, had some sort of tie to that, or who don't see it as such a distant thing. And I think that wanting to look at that time frame in the way that Stephen Kiss described as some sort of moral arbiter, maybe not historically a moral arbiter, but the way that they portrayed the shows in this rugged way, and where these gunslinging heroes, as he described, always come out on top and always beat the bad guy, and that whole notion of America will always win is definitely in those. And I think that's probably the big reason why those were so popular for that period of time, especially post-war, is that, even though post-war America was a very prosperous time, there's still a lot of woe because we had just gotten out of a world war. And there's always this nostalgia for the past. Every generation has a nostalgia for the past, and it just happened that the Old West, the expansion of America and that whole thing was a very nostalgic method for that generation of people. Now, how does that relate to Japanese cinema. So as I was talking about, in Japanese cinema, since film became, a medium for art, these period dramas have been made. Some of the earliest ones are in the aughts, 1911, 1912. Some is when these period dramas started. And Japan has had a long history of period plays. They have a whole art form called kabuki, which is telling their versions of fairy tales and their versions of historical tales and things like that, which are very flashy, bombastic plays. And in some instances, these Jidaigeki are like film versions of those kabuki plays, where they tap into their history. But specifically for these, they began when film began, the same way Westerns were in the United States. But there's this explosion of this genre in about the same time frame as American Westerns. American Westerns saw a huge uptick in creation of television shows and films from 49, post-war 49 to about 1970, and then it starts to die down. In Japan, it was almost the same, but with these period dramas. Post-World War II, when they started to rebuild, and they could, start spending, more time on making films and instead of the war effort and the whole thing. There was a huge boom of these period dramas. They still made, there's a lot of contemporary films, just like in America. There was a lot of contemporary television shows, a lot of contemporary films, but this one genre seemed to overtake the public mind frame. There's another word that I can't think of. It was what was popular at the time. And like I said before, there was 143 television shows in this 20-year span of Westerns. And about that same span, there were more films than television shows. Television shows in that genre didn't really take off until the 60s and a little bit later. But from that 1950-ish to 1970, there were 161 films, prominent films. I'm sure there are more that were made in this time frame that run the gamut of the time that I described, that almost 300 years of time frame. And I was curious as to why that was true. Because Japan is obviously a country that is a country and a culture that has existed centuries and centuries longer than the United States. Considering that that one period, the Edo period, that 200, almost 300 years, is one of many periods of history for Japan where 1600. The United States or America isn't even a thing yet. We're still a colony, and that just shows you how old other parts of the world are. But that's a different discussion for a different day. But why that period of Japanese history? Why not before 1600? Why not from 1868 to 1900 or 1930 or whatever? Why then? And I also, like I did with the Western, I did some online research and quick things, and I found a dissertation by a college student from, I want to say, the University of Chicago. Yes, but sadly, and I just found this out, I can't read it. It said it's not available, but there was one snippet, his thesis statement for his dissertation, talking about Japanese cinema from the post-war era and why it it dealt so heavily in that that earlier historical period of Japan. And I don't have a lot to go on, so this is mostly just conjecture from what I know of Japanese history and the film history and things like that. And just to give you some background on me, for those who are about to say, well, you don't fucking know anything. I did go to film school for 2 years. I'm an avid movie connoisseur, as they say. I watch a lot of films. I like a lot of foreign films, especially Japanese cinema. And that's not limited just to anime, because, you know, you can see, like, I've got a Sailor Moon there, and then my pops, most of them are anime related, but I do enjoy Japanese cinema. And I'm a history guy. I like learning history. I like talking about history. So, just a quick breakdown. The Edo period of Japan is one of the most peaceful eras, quote-unquote peaceful eras of Japanese history. And it's also when there's the least amount of outside influence from other countries. This period is when the shogun of the time, I'm pretty sure at the beginning it was Tokugawa Ieyasu was the shogun. When he came in power, he was like, no more outside influence. We're going to close the borders, essentially. So, you know, except for like 2 places down in like Hokkaido or something. No foreign country is going to come and, you know, influence us at all. So there was this, you know, this closing off of Japan and this ramping up of, you know, their national identity, essentially. But there's also, you know, a lot of infighting with the daimyos, which are kind of like regional governors and things like that, and like their samurai, which are their hired warriors, and like there was still skirmishes and civil wars, but for the most part, it wasn't as bad as the periods before that. Like the Sengoku era, which is the Warring States era of Japanese history, which is before the Edo period, where it's almost constant civil war all of the time, and you know the Portuguese are coming, and the Dutch are coming, and the Spanish are coming, and all these like the British, all these countries are coming to Japan and selling them guns and doing this sort of thing, and then after like this major war, the winners are like, yeah, fuck that. You know, we're going to close off the country. You know, a good resource to learn about Japanese history is Bill Wurtz's History of Japan. It's a great video, and it hits all the major points. But, like I said, this time period, this almost 300 years, is punctuated in the beginning by the ending of a lot of civil strife and war. And on the end, the 1868, you know, the ending is when, there it is, Matthew Perry, not Cook. Admiral Matthew Perry came to Japan and was like, hey, open up your borders, we want to trade with you. And if you don't, we're going to blow the shit out of your coastal cities. So, like, essentially strong-arming Japan into, you know, opening trade. And then since then, from 1868 until the early 20th century, Japan starts to westernize and starts to be influenced by outside countries again. And they start to lose their national identity. So that time frame before that, the Meiji Era, which is what it's called, and post the Sengoku Era, is one of strong national identity for the Japanese, assuming that I'm, you know, reading this correctly. And it's also, like I described with the Westerns, a very action-filled era. And there's 2 parts of it. You know, the the post-war Japan, having lost World War II at the hands of America and the Axis, Japan is starting to feel that feeling of, lost identity again. And they want to, through their film and television and other media, they want to hearken back to an era of their history that's strong, that was long-lasting, and that was very strong for them in an identity fashion. That era is very Japanese, as things are. They weren't being influenced by outside actors, and they knew who they were, and they weren't being pushed or pulled by Western civilizations anymore. So it only makes sense to me that the contemporary directors and writers of the time, post-war, who went through the war and saw this loss of national identity, would hearken back to a era of history where their national identity was strong, where the country cohesion was strong, in a sense, and where they weren't being, pushed or pulled or influenced by outside, nations. And that's why, in my mind, there was this huge boom for that genre of film and television. Now, why are they similar? That's the big question. They're similar because, face value, they're both historical period pieces for their respective, culture. Westerns are, American culture. The Jidaigeki and these samurai films are Japanese culture. But like I described with the Westerns and the samurai films, the Jidaigeki, is that they're hearkening back to a point in their respective culture and history to a different time. For America, it was about, American exceptionalism and American expansion and American ruggedness and the ability to face any odd and strength. For Japan, from what I can understand, being an outsider and not knowing all the historical context, who might have got everything wrong so far, but to me, it seems like it's hearkening back to a time that I described where there's little outside influence, where the national identity is very strong, and the history is very rich. And to find a way in post-war Japan to sort of find a cohesive thing to bring people together, because, our culture isn't just one thing. It's a multifaceted, multi-pronged thing. To have films and television shows and manga and books and poetry and all these sort of things kind of reach back and pull out some of that resolve and strength from our past is a good way to get through a point of strife in history. We look to our past and bring back things to help us move forward, to help us stay cohesive, whether that be national identity or whether that be some sort of moral system that we want to use the medium of these films to illustrate them. These two seemingly very different but actually very similar genres did for their respective cultures. Now, interestingly enough, they weren't islands unto themselves. Japanese cinema, especially this genre and the Western genre in America, are heavily influenced by each other, and I think it's because they have similar base characteristics to make them similar. I mean, yeah, they're both period pieces. Yeah, they both deal with their respective culture's history. But it's also about the types of characters that are portrayed in these films. Japan, in the Japanese culture films, you've got these samurai, which are kind of like the people who keep the law, or the strong men of Japanese culture. In the Western, you've got the gunslinger, you've got the ranger, the cowboy. These strong men of strong moral standing, you know, they're the arbiters of the Old West. You know, they protect the moral fabric of where they are. And that's the same way with samurai in these films, is that they are the protector of the people. They are the protector of honor. That is a very big thing in Japanese culture, is honor, personal honor, family honor, things like that. And the samurai is the embodiment of the protection of that and the importance of that. And I think that that's another parallel there. But I'll have to come back to this in part 2, because we'll get back to it in another video. But I'll see you guys next time when we talk a little bit more about what films have influenced each other.